It's obvious that we should not kill people just because we disagree with them. It's less obvious that Catholic apologists can say that without a hefty dose of inconsistency. In this video, I want to look at what two Catholic apologists have said about the death of Charlie Kirk. I'll point out that there are inconsistencies with their comments and the actions of the Catholic Church, and then I'll present what I think will be their response. And I'll show that said response doesn't help them on the charge of inconsistency. In fact, it might just make it worse. This is In Philosopher's Garb. I'm a Christian theologian, and we will kick things off by playing some clips.
And so if you think about it this way, Kirk is a representative of the idea that you win by having better ideas. The other approach is the one that his as yet unnamed murderer used, which is if you don't like what somebody is saying, you kill them. But it's in its most egregious form when it's private individuals trying to decide for the entire society what people are and aren't allowed to think. This is our version of the Charlie Hebdo murders. Like, either you stand up to this and say, whatever I think of the ideas being defended, we need to be able to say a small group of people don't get to just dictate this based on their own private vision of their own totalitarian idea of what is and isn't acceptable speech. And I would instead say the response to this has to be to strongly defend the idea that we want to win in the marketplace of ideas. We want to defend what we believe, not by violently imposing it, not by murdering people who disagree with us, but by making good arguments.
And here's what's so sad and frankly frightening to me about this incident. Nobody deserves to be murdered, even if they have disgusting, evil views. But you cannot kill our ideas because the truth cannot be killed. And deep down, it's that fear which motivates these cowards towards violence, because they know they cannot win in a fair political fight. They can only win if, as the quote attributed to Edmund Burke says, good men do nothing.
Okay, we shouldn't just kill people we disagree with. Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's wrong, right? Ideas should win or lose in the marketplace of ideas. Here's the problem with this claim. Historically, that is just not how the Catholic Church has operated. Historically, the Catholic Church has declared people heretics and then killed them unless they recant. And when this was done, it wasn't just one random Catholic doing something bad. These were instances in which the Catholic authorities, popes, ecumenical councils, things like that, they put people to death simply because they didn't like their teachings. The Waldensians were a group that rejected Catholic teachings on a number of areas, including a rejection of indulgences and a belief in the Bible as the ultimate authority. Do you know how the Catholic Church dealt with these teachings? Did they seek to win them over in the marketplace of ideas? No, they slaughtered them, and I do mean slaughtered. In 1211, 80 Waldensians were burned at the stake for heresy. In 1487, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull essentially calling for the extermination of the Waldensians. In 1655, there was a very famous massacre against them. This went on for a while. Pope Francis actually issued an apologies for these actions and recognized that they were unchristian and inhuman. And it wasn't just this group. There was also Jan Hus, who also spoke out against Catholic doctrine and was condemned as a heretic at the Council of Constance, which resulted in him being burned at the stake. After this, there was a full crusade against the followers of Jan Hus called the Hussite Wars or the Hussite Crusades. You also have the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars and the massacre of Béziers. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I think it's the name of a French town, so yeah, they probably pronounce it differently, where in that massacre, almost an entire village was just slaughtered because they wouldn't give up their heretics. Now, Catholic history is filled with the Catholic authorities doing these type of things, like the exact same type of thing that Joe and Trent are here condemning. And to be clear, it was the Catholic Church doing this. Sometimes Catholic apologists will try to be like, oh, well, the Catholic Church didn't do it. That was just the secular authorities. No. The secular authorities at this time were under the authority of the Catholic Church, so that will not cut it. And again, with something like the Waldensians, Pope Innocent VIII, he issued a bull calling for their extermination. So you're not going to get off the hook here. So I find it amusing that these guys would sit here and post a video about how wrong this assassination ideology is, and the only reason that they do this is because they know they can't win in the marketplace of ideas. They know that they're scared. Like, okay, let's follow that logic. That means the Catholic Church was scared when it was killing all these heretics. That means the Catholic Church knew in all these instances this was the only way they were going to be able to fight these things, right? And this is all, the supposedly divinely guided one true church and its infallible leader that has done this thing that they're criticizing, right? This should give us pause. And here's the thing, gentlemen, you can't have it both ways. The way I see it, you have two options. Option one, you can deny that the Catholic Church did anything wrong in all these instances in which it killed people for saying things they didn't like. You can use all the typical rhetoric about how these ideas are a disease that just need to be eradicated and how these ideas were just so harmful they couldn't be allowed to spread. But the second you do that, you give up any pretense of a moral high ground that you have against the people that you're critiquing in your videos. Because people like Charlie Kirk's shooter, well, they're just going to turn around potentially and say their actions were justified in the same way. Like, then both you and Kirk's shooter will be saying that it is okay to kill people to silence their speech. But then you'll be doing so inconsistently because you are creating rules for other people to live by that you exempt yourself and your church from. So I don't think these guys are going to go down this option, right? Like, I think they know better than to go down that option. Option two, which is what I think these gentlemen will want to do, is they will condemn what the Catholic Church did in the past. They're going to be like, yep, that was wrong. And, you recognize what these popes did, what the cardinals did, what the councils did, so on and so forth. They were wrong, they were unchristian, they were evil. And normally for most groups about really any other topic, that would be the end of things. And there wouldn't really be a point for me to even make this video in the first place, right? People make mistakes, but hopefully we grow as people and we look back and, we see our growth and we see us becoming more like Christ, so on and so forth. But here's the thing about this option. If you can look back at these actions of these past popes and these past councils, and you can recognize that their actions were wrong, their beliefs about how to deal with heretics were wrong, really badly wrong, then you are recognizing that you Joe Heschmeyer, and you Trent Horn, you have the ability to judge the Catholic Church. You have the ability to take the actions and the decrees of the Catholic authority, and you can hold that up to logic, reason, scripture, and basic human decency, and you can decide for yourself when what they say is correct or incorrect. You can judge what they what they allow is evil or good. And when you do that, that is precisely what Protestants have been arguing for all along. Protestants just take it one step further and say, not only can we see when your actions are wrong, we can also see when your teachings are wrong. Remember that Catholics want to say that God is infallibly guiding and protecting the teachings of this same church that I think we all agree committed grave moral atrocities. And this is where I think Trent and Joe are going to potentially enter into another inconsistency. You see, these guys will probably respond to me by saying, hey, James, you silly Protestant, we don't think the Pope is always right. We recognize he can make mistakes, but under certain circumstances, he is always right. They're going to argue that we should all think that God intervenes to preserve the infallibility of the Pope regarding doctrine that is set forth for all to believe, or something along those lines, right? But God doesn't intervene to preserve the infallibility of the Pope when the Pope is using the church to perform morally hideous actions. So thus we have another inconsistency. When the Pope is spouting doctrine they like and they want us to believe, well, God is protecting his speech and boy, you better listen. But when he does something obviously wrong that would, undercut the idea of divine guidance, well, now God isn't protecting his speech. Pay no attention to that. Not only is this inconsistent, it's obviously ad hoc. They are just drawing the lines of infallibility when it's convenient and how it's convenient, specifically in this way to avoid all the instances where the church is clearly wrong. So already we're seeing inconsistency in the rhetoric that these guys would want to use. But I think it gets worse when you look at some of their arguments in favor of papal infallibility. To show this, I want to engage with one of Joe's older videos where he talks about the idea of papal infallibility. In this video, Joe is explaining how Catholics don't believe the Pope is infallible, full stop. Rather, the Pope is infallible when he is putting forth a doctrine to be held by the universal church, something along those lines. Now, in that video, Joe gives kind of a quick and dirty argument for why you should think that all this is the case, why you should think God did this, right? He does this. We are now going to walk through this video together. It's not too long. It's pretty short because I think in doing so, we will see further inconsistency and frankly absurdity in how Catholic apologists utilize the Bible and their rhetoric in general. So this is how we will proceed. I'm going to play Joe's argument and we will walk through it together, and I will show just how awful it is in general. After this is done, I'm going to kind of look past all the ways that it is awful and how it misrepresents scripture, and then I'm going to point out ways that the argument as a whole I think is largely inconsistent in its logic and with other things that have potentially been said in this video, things like that. So we're going to go ahead and just hop into that. I do want to say at this point in the video, I'm transitioning more into a critique of Joe than I am a critique of Trent. I don't know if Trent would like give a big thumbs up to Joe's argument here and put him in the same camp of critique. So I'm just going to go ahead and say I'll start to shift the focus away from what both these gentlemen said. Now I'm specifically focusing in on Joe, just to be fair. All right, let's get going.
So why would those things be infallible? Well, we can put the case maybe a little bit this way. Jesus tells us a couple important things. Number one, that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. That's John 14:6. So we have to hold to the truth.
Okay, just so we're all clear, Jesus said that we have to come through him. Jesus didn't say if you ever unintentionally have a false belief about something spiritually related, like you can't be saved. This may seem pedantic, but Joe likes to play fast and very loose in his arguments, so we're going to hold his feet to the fire until his toes turn black on most of the things that he says.
But we also have to hold to unity. Jesus at the Last Supper, the same place he tells us he's the way, the truth, and the life, also prays for his future followers. He says, I pray not for these only, but also for those who believe in me through their word, that is, us. So what is his prayer for you and me? It's that we will all be one, even as he and the Father are one. Why? That they may believe in us, so the world may believe that thou hast sent me. So notice, he's saying we have to hold to unity, and it's vital for the success of the gospel that we do hold to unity.
First, no, that's not what Jesus said. Jesus asked, he prayed that his followers would be unified. And the reason is that through our unity, that would be a better witness. Jesus is here expressing what he wants to be the case, which, we should all want as well. What type of unity is being discussed here, we might ask? Well, Jesus isn't super clear. He doesn't define it. But based on the context of this passage and then the Gospels as a whole, I think that it should be considered about the unity of purpose and mission and, commitment to doing God's will and enacting it here on earth. Just as Jesus does not his own will, but the will of the Father, and so is one with him, in a sense there, we as Christians should all be one with each other in doing the will of the Father and bringing about God's kingdom on earth. We should be, united in mission, purpose, so on and so forth. And there's nothing in this statement by Jesus that hints at the notion that being unified in the way that he desires means that all of our beliefs about spiritual matters are just like carbon copies of each other. Like if I believe in, Christus Victor about atonement, and Bob believes in penal substitution, and Sally believes in ransom, right? Or, moral influence, like we can all still be unified and be one. We can all still serve on missions together and take communion together and just recognize that those are areas that, maybe like the Bible isn't 100% clear on. And so like we can have like, reasonable disagreement. Nothing Jesus says here implies that we have to all have the same beliefs about minor doctrinal points. And to be clear, even Joe and Trent would have to agree with me on this, because even in Catholicism, there are matters where Catholics differ. You may think they're small, but they're still there. So even you aren't unified in this absolute sense of, our beliefs. Like even you have some disunity in your beliefs. And so this is going to be really important, because this verse by Jesus is a go-to among Catholic apologists, because they're like, oh, look, Jesus said we should be unified. Therefore, you should all be unified and agreeing with me and trusting what I said. Just trust me, bro. So this is going to be crucial for Joe's argument. Jesus also never says that the church has to be unified in order to fulfill its mission. He does not imply it's a necessary condition. Rather, he indicates that the church being unified strengthens the effectiveness of the church. It's not as if some Christians fighting is going to somehow make it impossible for the church to live out its function. It's not going to live out its function as well as it could. It may present obstacles, but it may be less efficient, but it can still work. And if you doubt this, I would point out that the church has been fighting for essentially as long as we've been here, right? Like there have been conflicts and controversies in the church clearly throughout the centuries, and yet we're still here. We're still making a difference. We've still, progressed. Even if you want to, pick at Protestantism, which is supposedly, it's so disunified, we're the worst. Even in Protestant, church, with like how supposedly disunified we are, the Protestant church has still done a whole lot to bring people to Christ. Like, we've still been able to, get a lot done there and make a lot of progress. So that's just not what Jesus is saying. And Joe is representing it in this way because he's trying to set up a dilemma. He's trying to set up an argument, and being precise and consistent and careful with what the scripture says is not going to be beneficial to the argument he's trying to set up. So let's get going.
Like, imagine how much more successful Christianity would be if we weren't constantly fighting with one another.
I like that idea. If only the Catholic Church had felt that way when they were killing heretics who dared question their authority. Do you see what I'm getting at here? The same people preaching unity and saying that we shouldn't be fighting is the same group of people that has caused disunity through exiling people, declaring them anathema, and outright killing them when they have beliefs that the Catholic Church disagrees with. It's hypocrisy for, I think, apologists of this specific institution to get up and accuse everybody else of causing disunity in the church when they're the ones who have said, you can't have communion with us unless you believe these very specific things about how many angels can dance in the head of a pin, so on and so forth. Let's keep going.
So we have to hold these two things according to Jesus: truth and unity. Now, there's more than that, but those two are the ones that are going to be really important for us. And we can even put that kind of in the opposite direction. If you reject truth, what happens? Well, 2 Peter 2, St. Peter warns us about heretics who introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. So if you reject truth for the sake of error, you are risking at least spiritual damnation.
Okay, let's back this up. This statement does not imply that if you ever get a spiritual doctrine wrong, you're at risk of going to hell. There is no implication here that if you as a Christian unintentionally subscribe to a false idea, that you're going to go to hell. If you look at that quote that is on the screen, you'll see that it explicitly connects the destructive heresies with the denial of Christ. The threat of damnation has to do with the denial of Christ, not the fact that you got a question wrong on the theology quiz.
But likewise, if you reject the unity of the church, you're also risking spiritual damnation. St. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, talks about the works of the flesh, and he lists them and includes things like enmity and strife and dissension and party spirit. In other words, Christians who pit themselves against other Christians, Christians who break away from the unity of the church. And he warns that those who do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God.
That is not even remotely what that passage says. I've watched quite a few videos by Joe on a variety of topics at this point, and it is impressive how sloppy he is with his arguments, for lack of a better word, honestly. He will cite a verse, quickly tell you it means X, and then he'll just keep running with interpretation X and hope that you don't ask him to slow down so that you can examine how absurd his interpretation is. So that verse comes from one of Paul's writings, Galatians. And in that passage, it isn't directly talking about the church. It is just talking about, in general, the works of the flesh. And listed with that is strife, division, enmity, stuff like that. Now, we as Christians can all agree that, enmity, strife, they're not good things. Like, we shouldn't be, pursuing those. Like, those aren't things that we should, seek, stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that Paul is saying anybody who criticizes another in the church is producing this type of strife or division and therefore is going to hell. Which is what Joe is implying. Paul himself called out Peter for his actions. Was Paul being a hypocrite there? No, of course not. Paul caused all types of controversy when he preached the gospel in the synagogues. Was he promoting strife, division, enmity? Of course not. Quite a few of Paul's writings is him writing to the churches and rebuking them for their mistakes. Paul even begins this book of Galatians by saying, quote, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed," end quote. So Paul wants the church to constantly be on guard for false doctrine. And guess what? Paul wants us to be on guard even when it comes to the apostles. Paul speaks in the first person, even if we teach a different doctrine. Paul is telling the church that he wants them to be discerning even of what he, as an apostle, says. Yet we're supposed to believe that a few chapters later, Paul tells people that if they ever disagree with the church leader, they're going to hell. That's madness. That is what Joe is suggesting. Joe is suggesting that if you ever disagree and question the teachings of the Catholic Church, well, by golly, you're stirring up strife. You're stirring up division, enmity, and that can lead to hell. So you better be careful about not objecting to, oh, Papa, Catholic Church. Now, Joe just assumes that the enmity and strife is this very specific narrow meaning, and then he runs with it for his argument. Let's see how he does this.
That's an even clearer warning that that's damnable. So you may not be a heretic, you may not be a schismatic.
Notice what's going on here. Joe has engaged in, I think, a type of bait and switch. Paul was speaking in the first century, and he was condemning specific condemning specific teachings that he referred to as heresies, which he said were damnable. But then Joe switches this to mean, you cannot ever hold to anything that the Catholic Church declares to be a heresy 500 years later, right? Anything that is ever declared by the Catholic Church to be a heresy, even if it's like 600 years later, no matter what it is, if they call it a heresy, you're damnable if you hold to that belief. Paul has told us to be on guard, even from the apostles' teachings, and that we don't abandon sound doctrine. There is no conception that Paul would tell people that we should blindly follow what any church leader would teach, no matter what, for the rest of time. This is how Catholic apologists operate. They take a word like heresy that was used by Paul in a specific instance with a specific meaning and context. And then they say that, well, if you ever come to earn that title from Big Papa Catholic Church, then, all of a sudden, all of Paul's remarks apply to you. And this is not persuasive.
So here's the kicker. If your teacher in the church, your bishop, your pope, requires you to believe a certain doctrine in order to be a Christian, what are you going to do? Well, if that doctrine is erroneous, if the Pope says, by my infallible authority, I'm declaring this thing to be true and it's false, then every one of us has to say, okay, well, I'm going to accept this false doctrine and become a heretic, or I'm going to break away from the church and become a schismatic. And Jesus told us we couldn't do either of those things.
No, he did not. I hope it's clear now why I spent so much time being pedantic with each step of Joe's argument. Joe is setting up a dilemma that he thinks only papal infallibility can solve. Joe thinks that if the Pope gets up and says something that is clearly an error, and if we recognize that this was an error and we reject the teaching, Joe thinks, just based off of Galatians 5's comments about strife and division and so on and so forth, that we would be damnable if we rejected the teaching in that instance, which is crazy. Galatians 5 does not even remotely suggest that. They are just general statements about enmity, strife, division, so on and so forth. Paul has made it clear that if something like what Joe describes happens, well, Paul wants us to reject the teaching. He explicitly says that in the opening of Galatians.
And remember, in John 17, when he's praying for his future followers, he knows the future. He's God. When he's praying for us and telling us to remain one, he knows about corruption in the church. He knows about unworthy bishops and popes. And he knows about all of that stuff. And he doesn't say, okay, unless you really disagree, then go form your own church. He doesn't say that at all.
Jesus does not say remain one no matter what. Jesus expresses a hope and a request that God would help us remain one. But him expressing this request by no means implies that you can never reject a false teaching that comes from a church hundreds or thousands of years after his death. Jesus himself told us false prophets would come, wolves dressed as sheep. Jesus wants us to be on guard, just like Paul did. There's no idea here that Jesus is saying, well, if you ever disagree with the church leader, well, by golly, I'm gonna have a stern talking with you on come judgment day. Like, no, that's not the idea here. And again, the Catholic Church, the one that is screaming at the top of their voice that we need to remain unified and remain one, they're the people who historically have burned people at the stake for rejecting their authority and questioning their teaching. They are the ones that will exile you and declare you a heretic and make you anathema if they disagree with you on a doctrinal point that doesn't even remotely affect salvation or even how we live out like a Christian walk in our everyday life. The inconsistency here is astounding.
So that's why we believe in infallibility, because it's the only way to harmonize the biblical evidence. Papal infallibility, and more broadly, the infallibility of the church, makes sense of that. But notice again, it doesn't touch on everything. It touches on those things that are put forward as binding upon us as Christians.
You hear that? His reason for infallibility is that it is the only way to solve this dilemma. that he has concocted. By twisting scripture and misrepresenting it, he has created a problem that only papal infallibility can solve, supposedly. Now, I want to point out the absurdity of this, right? This is where we're going to kind of tie this back into what we were talking about in the beginning. Supposedly, we are to believe that God protects the Pope's message under certain circumstances because it protects us from being guilty of the strife and enmity that Paul touches on, right? That's one of the horns of Joe's dilemma. If God didn't do this, then oh boy, we might become guilty of strife and, division, enmity, and God doesn't want that. So God is going to protect the Pope's message on doctrine. So we aren't ever in this situation of having to make this choice where we, might morally feel like we have to do something that would cause strife in the church, right? We are supposed to believe that, while also believing that God has no problem with the Pope putting Christians in a position to commit the strife and enmity that comes through the mass slaughter of heretics. Really, guys? When God is looking at a Pope who is about to endorse the large-scale slaughter of heretics, God apparently is not concerned enough with how that action will create strife and enmity to step in and prevent the Pope from saying something wrong. But when God is looking at a Pope who's about to say something that is doctrinally untrue and might cause disagreement in the church, then oh boy, that disagreement in the church is a strife that God just has to protect us from. So now he's going to step in and make sure the Pope doesn't say anything wrong. This is laughable. We are to believe that God is willing to step in and make the Pope infallible to stop the strife of raised voices in a church, but God won't step in and make the Pope infallible to stop the strife of an entire city being slaughtered. But here's the thing. It actually gets much worse, I think. Because of God's failure to stop the Pope from commanding and allowing immoral actions, strife and division is caused not just by the people who killed the heretics, but also by the people in the church who might object to these actions. According to Joe and Trent, if I see somebody killing another person just to silence them, that's wrong, right? It's improper. That should not be done. I should conclude that that is wrong, and I should, have some type of stand against that action, right? Well, okay, let's suppose that I'm in the church in the 15th century, and I hear about the papal bull to completely exterminate the Waldensians, right? According to Joe, because this is not a statement that sets out a doctrine that the whole church must hold, right, to be saved, I don't have to think it's infallible. Which means in this instance, I am not only morally justified in objecting to this papal bull, I would say I'm morally obligated to stand against it because we all agree it's wrong, right? I mean, Trent himself said that evil prevails when good men do nothing. If the Pope is using his authority to do something wrong, we should want bishops and cardinals to stand up to him and fight back. Right, gentlemen? But if they did that, in that instance, it sure does seem like that would cause strife and division in the church just as much as if they stood up and said the Pope was wrong about some doctrine. Strife can arise in the church because one objects to the Pope's actions, permissions, and commands just as much as it can arise from one objecting to the doctrine that the Pope sets forth. So if the Pope is only protected on matters of doctrine, God isn't really protecting you from being in this position that you're saying he protects us from being in, right? Or you might morally need to do something that would cause some strife within the church. God is only removing one possible avenue that might put you in that position, but all these others still remain. In fact, I can even put an argument something like this. 1, if a pope commands or encourages the killing of heretics, that is morally wrong. 2, when we recognize that things are wrong, we are morally obligated to stand against them. 3, if Christians recognize that the Pope's commands about killing heretics are wrong, then they are morally obligated to stand against it. 4, Christians standing against the sitting Pope and his papal teachings is going to cause strife and division and enmity in the church. 5, the Pope has commanded or encouraged the killing of heretics in the past. 6, that means there are times in the past where a Christian could be morally obligated to stand against the Pope and his actions despite the fact that it will cause strife and enmity or division in the church. 7, but wait, causing strife and division and enmity in the church in any way is damnable, according to Joe, right? Thus, according to Catholic apologist logic, there have been times in the past where a Christian recognizing that something is wrong would have morally obligated them to perform an action which is damnable. And that is wackadoodle. That is absurd, right? But how are you going to get out of this argument? If you deny premise one, then we're back to where we started. And I'm just going to say that Joe and Trent are inconsistent in their condemnation of assassination culture against people, you disagree with, because, the Catholic Church does the same thing. And so you haven't condemned them. So you can't reject premise one and be consistent, just in general on condemning these type of actions. If you deny premise two, what happened to the approving quote that evil triumphs when good men do nothing? What about all the times in scripture where we're told to correct oppression? How are you going to rally Christians to fight against things like abortion if apparently they have no moral obligation to fight against evil? Nobody in their right mind can reject premise two. Premise three just follows from premise one and premise two. Premise four is obvious. If you think that a bunch of bishops or cardinals openly condemning the actions of the Pope would not cause division in the church, you think that's not going to cause strife, you're just intellectually dishonest if you try to maintain that. Premise five is a historical fact. Premise six just follows from the other premises. Premise eight also follows from the other premises, which means the only place you can object is premise seven. But that's the premise that does all the heavy lifting in Joe's argument for papal infallibility. Supposedly, God would just never allow it to be the case that you'd be caught in this situation where you would have to cause strife or division in the church by objecting to a doctrine. Supposedly, God would never put you in this position because if you did such a thing, well, then that would be damnable. Because God doesn't want you to be put in this damnable catch-22, God makes sure the Pope never says anything that you would need to object to. That is Joe's whole argument. But if God only protects the Pope's statements about doctrine and not also what he allows, encourages, and commands, then it is still the case that Christians are going to be faced with this, catch-22, where there are instances where we have to do something which is supposedly damnable. There are going to be instances where we have to stand against the one performing evil, even if it means making oneself a heretic or schismatic or whatever. God, I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. God only sometimes making the Pope infallible doesn't solve the problem that Joe has created. So how do we solve the problem? You just recognize that premise 7 is dumb. You can recognize that even if objecting to something in the church, even if that causes strife or division, that is not necessarily damnable. If it's warranted, it can be warranted to do that. And, assuming you do it in the right way. But the second Joe admits that, he gives up his catch-22 argument by abandoning one of the horns of the dilemma that he wanted to impale us on. So if Joe wants to cling to premise 7, he's going to have to commit himself to saying that the Pope has never used the church to do anything morally wrong. But Joe and Trent have been quite emphatic that killing people just because you disagree with them is wrong. So what's it going to be here, fellas? Because the way I see it, your argument and your rhetoric, they just don't match up with each other. Thus, inconsistency. These guys cannot have their cake and eat it too. They're going to have to decide what they care more about. So let's start to bring this to a close. Joe, Trent, you're right to be disgusted by the actions of Charlie Kirk's shooter and, assassination culture in general. You are right to criticize those who support these actions. But whatever outrage, whatever disgust you feel towards Charlie Kirk's shooter and other modern instances of assassination culture, your disgust and your outrage at the Catholic Church should be greater, because the Catholic Church has done this to way more people for centuries. And these actions have come from the very institution that you say is the one true church, the same institution that you say carries the authority and weight of St. Peter himself, that God has been, guiding and protecting from error. The same institution that you want Protestants to blindly follow by checking our brains at the door. And in the past, when the Catholic Church committed these atrocities, do you know why they were able to get people to do it? I suspect it's because the people believed that the Catholic Church spoke for God. If you believe the Pope speaks for God and the Pope says that it is good and acceptable to go kill heretics, it's really not terribly surprising that we would see a bunch of people going and killing heretics. However, if the church had fostered an environment where the questioning the church and its authorities was, that was encouraged, maybe, just maybe, we would not have had so many church-sponsored atrocities. And the fact that the church, led by the Pope, has done these things strikes hard at the doctrine of papal infallibility, regardless of your ideological gerrymandering of it. There is no reasonable way to justify this absurd line drawing of where the Pope is infallible and where he isn't, because the one thing that God is supposedly protecting you from by making the Pope infallible regarding doctrine, that one thing can still hit you from a bunch of other angles. So either commit to saying that the Pope is infallible, full stop, say it with your chest, and stop complaining about assassination culture against guys like Charlie Kirk, or keep objecting to assassination culture and recognize that the Pope is fallible, full stop. And for all the Catholics who are watching, I just want you to know I'm an equal opportunity critic when it comes to this stuff. I have and will continue to criticize Protestants for their errors. I also want you to know that I want us to have unity together. And I think that Catholics and Protestants should be able to put our doctrinal differences aside and enact God's kingdom on earth together despite our differences. I think that Catholics are my brothers and sisters in Christ, and I will gladly break the bread of communion with any of you, regardless of our ideological differences, if only your unity loving church allowed you to break that same bread with me.